interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Debrief. I am your host, Sam Fairlamb, and today we're talking about gaining research experience as a student. Should you do it? And if so, why should you do it? And if you were to think about applying for a research post, what are the things that we can advise you to improve your chances of being successful? I'm joined today by Dr. Saloni Krishnan, as well as PhD students Amrita, Bains and Clare, Lally. Thank you both all of you for joining me. How are you all doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. So let's get right into it then. I assume maybe all of us did do some research experience when we were undergraduate students. But of course, I guess the first question I would like to ask then, is this something that you should only do if you want to apply for a PhD? Is this a very niche thing that we should be thinking about?
I guess I can take that to start with. So with my kind of other hat on, I'm a lecturer in the department, but I'm also the careers and employability lead. So I've got to know quite a bit about what people are looking for and what helps them be successful after they graduate. And one of the things about doing a research assistant role is it's great if you want to do a PhD, because ideally you could get yourself on a paper and that looks really, really strong when you do apply for a master's or a PhD program. But one of the things people sometimes forget is that when you're interested in clinical psychology, for example, one of the components of that interview is a research interview, and having the kind of skills that you'll pick up from being an RA is really essential, actually, to possibly acing that interview. So I've always encouraged people to take in kind of relevant bits of research experience. And then again, the specifics of that research experience might matter. The other thing that RA roles are really good for is also things like if you get a chance to work with some data and learn a skill that goes beyond, like, say, SPSS. So in my lab, students tend to learn R, for instance, and that's really great as a kind of selling point outside of university if you want to go on to anything that involves you handling data. So market research jobs are one instance that comes to mind. And I think finally, there's the kind of short-term gain, right? You read so much about research as a student, but you never really, you have these typical criticisms like, hey, what about gender? These people didn't balance for gender, or they collected a sample that was too small. And sometimes actually doing the research can help you contextualize that. Like, what are the challenges you face? What's the process by which you design and conduct the research? And that kind of helps you understand why people design research the way they do throughout your degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that you mentioned about the kind of short-term gains for your learning. I think often when you are learning as a student, it's it's difficult to try and think critically about the research that you're reading when you're on the outside, so to speak. Whereas when you're kind of actually doing the work yourself, you kind of understand the processes of why you set up things certain ways, some of the decision makings that go into designing an experiment a certain way. And I think it helps you kind of hone and improve your ability to critically think about research once you start doing it yourself. So I think there is a real added bonus to try and do it from a learning perspective. Now, Amrita and Clare, I believe both of you did research internships when you were undergraduate students. So I thought perhaps it would be quite good if you could both maybe give a bit of insights into what exactly you did, maybe some of the challenges that you found along the way, and that kind of stuff. So maybe if we start with you, Clare, first.
Yes, so I did an undergraduate research assistant post at University of Leeds when I was an undergrad student. And I was basically helping one of my lecturers recruit infants and adults to do a study looking at how we incorporate gesture into kind of communication. And to begin with, it kind of started with the basics of just collecting data and kind of getting an idea of how there's the sort of things you have to do to set up a lab and to kind of go through the ethics and consent forms, so things that are going to be really, really important if you go on to have a research career. But then kind of in return, that my lecturer sort of invested time with me to help me develop skills. For me, it's with SPSS, because I came from a linguistics degree. I never actually did any formal statistics. So my lecturer kind of gave me an insight into that, and then kind of helped me think about how I could apply these skills to my undergraduate dissertation. And from that experience, it was pretty fundamental in me then applying for my second job out of uni was a full-time paid research assistant post for 18 months at Royal Holloway. So the undergrad experience was good, kind of almost short-term gain to get this kind of longer post. And there I found what was really valuable is just the idea that you get to see the research pipeline from start to finish. So you get to kind of sit in on the meetings where the ideas are kind of come up with, you get to collect the data yourself. And I found what was really, really helpful with that post was one, kind of meeting people in the research community and getting some good mentors. So I went on and did a PhD with my research supervisor, and it was really valuable that I had 18 months experience working with her already, so we knew we worked well. But even outside of going into a PhD, I got to do lots of things like present my work at conferences, and having that kind of presentation skills I think would have been helpful for many future careers, and kind of like Saloni said, really develop my kind of data analysis skills as well. I'd also say, just based on kind of going on to an academic post, a great thing about a research assistant post is they're looking for trainees, and you kind of get to make some mistakes under supervision. You kind of learn what works and what doesn't. So you get to try it out before you kind of fully commit to a research career, if that's kind of the direction you're looking at. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you mentioned about how these research intern posts they give you an opportunity to make mistakes. I think something maybe we should just probably make clear is that these intern posts, they're not necessarily for people that are super skilled. They go to fairly general students who, have learned some psychology, but still have a lot more to learn. And part of it obviously will be them making mistakes along the way, but that's okay. Amrita, what about you? What was your experience as a research intern? What did you do? Sounds like Claire's was fairly substantial. Was yours quite similar?
Yeah, in a way. So I think my first research assistant role, it was in my undergrad. So I was at Aston University before I came to Royal Holloway, and they're really big on placement years. So I was actually a research assistant in Brazil. It was very, very different. So I think what was quite cool about that is just seeing how research was done in a different country, in a different culture, and just seeing how it worked, and develop my research skills. And it was definitely beneficial. It gave me the skills to then go out and apply for different research assistant roles. So I think during my master's, I did a research assistant position with Dr. Laura Shapiro on the Aston Literacy Project, which looked at reading development and literacy development from early years all the way up until secondary school. And both of these positions at the time were unpaid as well. And I just wanted to do it to see, is research for me? Is this something that I wanted to do? And luckily it worked out really well. One thing that I really liked is that by going into these different labs and working with different people, you network so much. So by working with Laura Shapiro, I ended up meeting Jessie Ricketts and Saloni Krishnan, and then became their research assistant for a bit. And then, as Claire said before, I got to develop a relationship with them, which obviously helped going on to do a PhD with Saloni and Jessie too.
I mean, there's so much to unpick there. I mean, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm super jealous of being able to go to Brazil. When I did my research intern post when I was here as an undergraduate student, I did go places just nowhere near as exotic as Brazil. I went to Hastings to interview children and police officers. But you also mentioned that obviously the internship that you did is not really that related to the PhD you're now doing, which I think is an important point, that it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're super interested in this project and you're going to take this up in the future as something you're going to do long term. Certainly wasn't the case for me. I worked with, as I mentioned, obviously it was on a project about children's attitudes towards the police, interviewing children, going to police stations, interviewing police officers about their experiences. It's not what I did in my PhD in the end. I went to go and do look at Islamophobic prejudice. But nonetheless, it gave me more of an understanding about types of research methods. And also, as you mentioned, it opens up new ways of thinking about psychology. You get to learn new people. And I think that's really important when you think about learning, is there's no set answer in psychology about how do you do things, right? It's, if you go and spend time with various different researchers, you will learn very different perspectives. I'm sure we could have lots of different debates about how you precisely design a study or other types of things. And I think that really part of the learning process is kind of amalgamating all those experiences to then form your own opinions. And so, I think it's a really kind of interesting point about how you kind of got to meet so many different types of researchers through, starting out these kind of internships to really kind of build your understanding of psychology and methodology and so forth.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, we should probably note that obviously it's going to vary slightly by institution about what they offer and that kind of thing. But perhaps, Saloni, perhaps you can just sort of give us an understanding about, at Royal Holloway at least, what type of internships are available.
Yeah, I guess as everyone's been saying, there's a lot of variety in all of this. Occasionally, you will find that a researcher has a bit of money and they're willing to kind of create a kind of paid RA role. So for instance, when Amrita first came to work with us, I had a bit of money. So, we were able to kind of pay Amrita to come and work with us. And that's really great. And I've been able to do that for a couple of RAs in my department. I think that's really great for equality as well, because we want to make sure that it's not just students who can afford to do research experience that get the chance to do that. So we are trying to provide those opportunities. However, it's really hard for researchers to have that type of funding. And so there are a couple of things that actually can help. So for example, if you are doing something and you find that there's this great researcher in your area and you'd love to work with them, but they don't have money, you really need the money, there are bursaries you should specifically think of applying to. So for example, the EPS offers an undergraduate research bursary, the BPS does as well. And I think the EPS has two at various different points, one after you graduate and one while you're still an undergraduate. These are applications, so your supervisor has to kind of commit to writing them with you. So I think, as Claire and Amrita have been saying, it's kind of useful to be in touch with people in advance and develop that relationship and develop that application. And I think it's useful to say that even if that application doesn't go anywhere, the process of putting together one is a learning skill in and of itself, because you're doing a piece of writing with someone who's very experienced at writing. So that's, I think, something I would definitely recommend. As employability lead, equality is something we're really thinking very seriously about, and it's something that is on our minds. So this year, we're going to be trialing a new program called the Psychology Undergraduate Research Bursary Scheme. And the idea for that is kind of twofold. One is that we want to make sure that, there's some standardization in the process by which students might be able to see what RA opportunities are advertised in the department. So we'll encourage supervisors to kind of release roles at the same time, and presumably also shortlist on a kind of blinded basis. So the idea would be that your name and so on wouldn't be available, just your kind of CV and why you want to do that particular placement. We also want to support this with a little bit of money. And unfortunately, we can't offer quite the same as, what you might get on a paid RA role, but we want to offer at least kind of small bursaries of about £250 or so to work with a supervisor. And based on how many people apply and how many placements there are, the idea would be that if you got a placement with a supervisor and we had enough money, then everybody would get a bursary. But if not, we would like to means test this. So we would specifically like to ask students what they would do with the money. And I think because we view this as a way for helping people who can't afford it get on that ladder and kind of get that experience. And so we hope that people who, would like to be paid but don't necessarily have to be will understand why we're drawing that distinction. But we very much want it to be a way of enabling people to kind of feel like research is for them and, hopefully supporting them to do that.
I mean, I think it's great that there seems to be a lot that you're trying to do to ensure that, these internships, they're inclusive and they go to a wide variety of individuals and people aren't, sort of hindered by the fact that perhaps giving up a lot of time for no real money, is something that they can't do. So I think those initiatives sound great. You mentioned also, I think it probably leads into the next question I wanted to ask about, regardless of really the outcome of whether you're successful or not, the process of the application still can be quite valuable, regarding of improving your ability to write and apply for jobs and so forth. So my next question was to kind of consider, if now we've convinced some students that maybe they should consider applying for an internship, what is going to increase their chances of success? And I guess maybe one of the first things that we can ask ourselves is, I don't know, maybe whether, Saloni, you've ever reviewed sort of student applications for RA posts, but what are the kind of common mistakes that you find students might make in an application?
I think one thing we will all tell you is the value of tailoring. So you don't want your research kind of placement thing to be like, well, I just really want a research placement. That sounds really great. Please, can I have one? You want it to be specific to the lab you want to work in. So why are you interested in the kind of research they do? Have you looked at their website? Have you read some of their papers? Can you kind of bring that in? And as I think you go a bit further in the process, you kind of have to refine what you do as well. So Amrita and I were discussing the other day that I was once interviewing for a paid RA role, a bit like what Claire was talking about, with a person who had written a blog post about how to apply for a paid RA role. So like a proper full, 10-step process as to how you could be the most successful at getting a role. And we realized that of the kind of 80 people that had applied, maybe 2 had looked at it. So a little bit of stalking of like a lab you want to work in is probably encouraged. Like you do want to know a little bit about them and really tailor your application to them. The other thing with undergraduates, I think, and this perhaps won't pop out, is how has what you have done already relate to that lab? So for example, if you're applying to a lab that is, where your placement is going to be statistics, you kind of want to talk about the courses you have done with statistics, perhaps talk about your marks if they were good, talk about the experience that you have on those courses, like your mini project, for instance. Equally, if you're applying for a lab that is going to do stuff like testing babies, you might want to refer to your developmental psychology modules. And so tailoring it, but also kind of bringing in very specifically what you've been doing in your degree is really important. Also, at this kind of stage of like undergraduate careers, we don't expect undergraduates to have 4-page CVs. And if they do, they're likely to be irrelevant to a specific role. So again, if you are applying to, say, work with people in some context, then actually like your experience of working in a bar is possibly useful. Tailor it and show how it is actually going to be useful. And if you think that actually you're going to be working with children and that experience working in a bar is not useful, then take it out. Your CV doesn't have to be a record of everything you have ever done in your life.
And of course, those points don't necessarily just apply for when you apply for an RA post, but it applies just generally, to when you apply for any job. You want to make sure that you've done the due diligence to look at the company you're applying for, tailor your CV, tailor your covering letter. I mean, my personal experience has been whenever I've hired for a research intern, it's the first thing I look for is whether it feels like they've actually read what I put down in the application. So whether they've mentioned and given lip service to the kind of area of research that I do and what's on it. And the ones that I immediately kind of tend to disregard are the ones that just don't feel like the ones that could have been submitted to about 10 other researchers in the department. It wasn't necessarily specific to my own. In fact, actually, kind of going back now some time to when I actually got my RA post as a student, I was really not confident that I was actually going to get the position. I had really long hair, just didn't really feel like, this is the kind of person that would get an RA post. But they offered me the job, and I remember the first time I was really surprised, and I kind of emailed back just saying sort of like, why would you do such a thing? And they basically turned around and said, well, you're the only person that actually had looked up any research in the area. I had actually the night before the interview, at least anyway, but also I think I put down on my application too, just went and looked up a bit of research on children's attitudes towards the police and just put it in as a sentence. It didn't take that long, but it showed that I had thought about it. And so, that was one way that I was successful. So I think that's a really useful tip. You also mentioned, obviously, I think elaborate on your grades. I think sometimes what I tend to find is that students, they kind of take for granted that you would just know things. So they might just say, oh, you know, I learned SPSS, but tell me what you know about SPSS, for example. You know, like if I want you to maybe do work in my area doing like ANOVAs, then it's useful just to spell that out to me, so that it's kind of clear to me that you do actually know a bit about SPSS. Don't assume that I would just accept that SPSS is you know it, therefore. So, okay, so we looked at maybe applications. One thing I guess just probably worth asking before we move on to maybe interviews is, how much do you think grades really matter? I mean, often you might see in these applications, they say, like, oh, you know, you need to have a minimum of a 2-1. How much do you think personally, I don't know, Saloni, how much do you kind of emphasize or focus on grades? Is this something that, you know, grades is important, or is it not as essential as other things?
I'd be lying if I said grades weren't important, but there are other things that are also important. So for example, engagement and attendance. Generally, if you're applying for an RA post within the department, we can look up stuff about, you know, your grades or your attendance. We don't always do it, but actually someone who attends their classes 90% of the time or 100% of their time, I would feel very confident is going to be reliable and show up to things. And sometimes for a research assistant position, that's what you want, the reliability. It would be difficult for me to convince myself to take on someone with a 2-2 unless they could give me a clear reason as to why they had achieved a 2-2 and what they were kind of doing in like the next steps. Because I mean, the first year, for example, is a bit of a trial year, right? So if you just found something really difficult and your grades weren't quite what you expected, you're getting used to university, tell me that, and I will view that then slightly differently as to whether you just don't see anything about it. But I think, yeah, engagement is really, really important, perhaps even more so than grades. And that tailoring again, like how much do you want to work in this area? So one of my interview questions generally tends to be something around the specific role they're applying for. What have you read in this area?
Yeah, and I think you can be kind of creative as well about maybe how you display your grades. I mean, sometimes we can think about it as just an overall mark that you gained a 59 average or 63 average, but not all of that kind of average is necessarily going to be, I guess, relevant to the role. So, you know, for example, you mentioned already about SPSS and stats. You know, if you did well in that course, but not in other ones, you can creatively kind of sort of, I got a 2-1 in stats with, you know, and, you know, for example, my experience has been, I'm terrible about biology. You know, it's not the kind of research assistant post that I would apply for. And it certainly did bring down my grades when I was a student. But, you know, I can selectively kind of go, well, look, you know, based on these modules, which are mostly relevant for that area, I'm getting 2-1s or a first, you know, so I think also there's a kind of creativity that maybe you can use.
I think you can also show almost a bit of a learning curve. If it's, say, a module that's relevant to your RA application, and you can show how you raised your grade from this to this because you've put the work in, you know, RAs aren't expected to be like perfect track records. It's showing, I think willingness to learn is just as important, and what kind of PIs will value. Because you can always think the other way as well. I think that even if you have like the highest grades in your year, your top of your year, you should still be showing a willingness to learn, because I definitely think you can also have negative experiences with people applying to be RAs and thinking they know everything already, when obviously you're meant to be learning from your lab as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In fact, it kind of reminds me of, I hired an RA student this year, the year just been, and one of the students I eventually ended up hiring, she didn't actually have the strongest grades. I had quite a few applicants, lots of them who were kind of getting firsts, and there was this particular student who didn't actually have the strongest grades, but their application to me was just perfect in terms of what I was looking for. They kind of just outlined, you know, I'm taking your third year course. I think it's great. I'm really interested in that area. I want to learn more. And to me, it was like, that's what I want, I guess, more so than just necessarily a student who clearly can do well on an assessment. I mean, obviously that's useful, but I want to be able to give it to a student that clearly is passionate. And not only that, but I also think you kind of noted there's an opportunity here for us to give students roles where they can learn and develop. And I think sometimes there's an advantage to often give it to maybe a student who could gain a little bit more because maybe their grades aren't, you know, 95s throughout. You know, if you're a 95 student, do you necessarily need all this extra experience? I mean, it can be also useful from that kind of perspective too. So I guess maybe the bottom line is, I guess grades are useful, but I don't think we should necessarily, if you're a kind of 2-2 or a low 2-1 student, don't be discouraged from applying. I think that you can still potentially get these kind of positions, and it's maybe therefore key to really think about how you write your covering letter.
I guess the flip side to that is, if you are that student with a 95, put it on your CV.
Yeah.
So I recently saw a CV from a student who said she was predicted to achieve a 2-1. And then her name, well, maybe I won't say it. It was a few years in the last few years, but then her name was on the list of prizes for achieving a high 95 throughout history. And you're like, well, brag about that. Brag about stuff you have done and have achieved. Don't kind of feel like you need to be modest. This is not the place to be modest.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I keep trying to learn when I, have applied for jobs is it doesn't really gel with me to kind of brag about myself, but it is quite useful just to, if you've got a 95, say it. If you're a really high performing student, say it, because it's going to put you at an advantage. And I think it's important to try and sell the positive aspects of yourself, whether it's academics, whether it's motivation, passion, whatever it is, but try and sell it as best as possible. So I think it's a great point. Okay, so sorry, go on, Claire, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say one of the easiest ways to kind of have to, I know it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people to kind of sell themselves, or if it can feel like a brag. Like, I think one of the simplest ways to do it with any job application is because you literally get a list of the job specs, treat it like you're being asked a question on it. So you're not just putting yourself out there and just saying, I'm so amazing. On the application, it might say, we're looking for someone with confident presentation skills. And then it kind of forces you to quantify it. Yeah. And you're not really bragging about yourself anymore. You're just answering a question that your future employer or PI needs to know.
Yeah.
So I think
I got told when I was applying for research assistant roles, because I find it really hard to say the things I've done, and then I always got told no, Amrita, you have done this and you've done this, brag. And I suppose it is a bit of a weird thing when you're like, oh God, I'm bigging myself up a bit too much here. What if I don't perform free, which you always do in the end. But I got told to do what I think, a spider diagram, and write down the little list of things I've done. So, okay, I was in this job, I worked at Nando's. Okay, I used to talk to people. My communication skills are good. And then you just you bring out all this list and you're like, okay, from this list, what can I transfer over to this job? And you find out actually there's a lot of things you can give over to the research assistant role.
I think that's also linked to an important thing about people not ruling themselves out based on how many of the specs they hit. So, I mean, I don't have the statistic to mind, but I know it's quite well established, isn't it, that men are more likely to apply for a post when they fulfill less of the criteria than women. And I'm sure there's lots of similar things for underrepresented groups in terms of, if you don't hit all of the points, sell the ones you can, and again, think about how you can link to the ones you can, because that can be a real problem as well with kind of diversity.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point to make, that not always should you just go, well, I can't apply because I don't have this particular thing they're asking for. I mean, if you meet all the other criteria, go for it. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one thing that I judge applications on is what I think a student can get out of it. And so if a student comes to me and says that I've got all these criteria, and then just hits the issue on the head saying, I don't have experience with this, but I'd love to learn it, and I really think that this position can help me gain those extra skills that I feel would be really valuable for me in the future. That's another criterion for me that would let me think I should try and think about hiring this person and going forward to the interview stage with that individual. So I think it's a really great point, Claire. I
wanted to add that along this road, there's probably going to be a lot of rejection, and that isn't personal. And it can feel really personal when you get something that says nope, you weren't the right fit. And it can feel even more so if you interviewed for a position and you felt oh yeah, I thought I had a really good shot. I got along with them really well. And then they say, no, we've offered it to someone else. It really is impersonal. Try and get feedback in those situations, and keep applying, because it wasn't specifically about you, but just maybe that, the number of people that applied and someone else had a slightly better fit to that specific role.
Yeah, try again. I mean, eventually perseverance will lead to that kind of success. And get feedback when you do get a rejection. Just email and just say, look, can you give me just some advice of how maybe I could have improved my covering letter, or how I could have improved in the interview, and maybe then you can take some bits on board and be more successful next time. So let's actually focus on that interview before we finally finish. I guess we've talked about the application. Now, what necessarily differs at an interview in comparison to an application? Saloni, I don't know whether necessarily there's something you're looking for differently in an interview setting rather than the application.
Well, Amrita and I just did some, so I wonder if she wants to talk about it.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, so this is probably like one of my first times when I've been on the other side. So like interviewing, or like it was an informal interview, I'll say. And it's quite interesting. So I think one of the big questions that we asked was like, why this particular project? Like, why have you come here? And I suppose, like, as you mentioned before, Sam, like if someone has that passion and says like, I like this area, I like what you're doing, I want to know more, and they can shine through so easily there, even if they don't have like all the required skills that were on the job spec or something. And I think sometimes it's just quite nice, like putting a face to a name, and in an interview you can just like talk, so the things that you weren't brave enough to mention, or like you were a bit like too shy to put onto an application, you can just say out loud. Yeah, I don't know, Saloni.
Yeah, I guess also it's just a chance to see, not only for the interviewer, but for you to see how you fit in with the kind of ethos of that lab. Would you like working with this person? I remember doing an interview once and I was just like, okay, on the basis of the interview, even if they offered me the job, I'm not taking it. And I think it's important to realize that even though you're the one being interviewed, you actually hold many of the cards. So it's not supposed to be a threatening experience. It's meant to be a chance to kind of chat and go through some things. I guess the other thing about an interview is that I try to make my interviews quite structured, so everybody has the same questions, and in a way that standardizes the process a little bit, so I can kind of feel like, well, I've given everyone the same opportunity to think about things, perhaps on the fly, perhaps to give me evidence of things they may not have automatically thought of putting in their application, and then you can judge people a bit more evenly, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point that these interviews are often standardized. Certainly I standardize mine with, sort of 4 or 5 questions that everyone is going to get the same for. And I think, Amrita, you kind of mentioned also the, I guess part of it is sort of putting a name to a face. It's quite often hard to really evaluate just what you see on paper. You then need to kind of back that up with an interview where you can kind of get a sense of, does this feel like a person that I could work with? Do I think this person, as Saloni pointed out, fits with the ethos of this lab? You can also kind of double check some of the things that you would have already have looked for in the application as well, like that kind of passion, commitment, motivation for the area. Is there anything else we would advise for a student in an interview?
I think I could probably offer some maybe reassurance. I don't know. Something I found really helpful with interviews is, so between my undergraduate degree and my RA post, I worked in a commercial role where I used to interview people quite a lot, and kind of like Amrita said, having that experience of being the other side does kind of simplify it. I think people think interviews is this big, I don't know what's going to happen, but from my experience as an interviewer, they're normally sitting on the other side with boxes they want to tick to check that you fulfill the role, and then just to feel for you as a person. So it doesn't have to be this big test where you don't know where it's going. It's meant to be a conversation, and you can usually look back at the specs in your application to kind of prepare some answers and things to kind of make you feel more ready. Something someone at Careers Service said to me once, which has always helped me feel more confident going into interviews, is that if you've been offered an interview, they think you can do the job already, and they just want to have a further chat with you. If they don't think you could do the job, you wouldn't have got the interview. So I think that's always worth kind of giving yourself a bit more confidence as you go into it. And also, honestly, the interview for my RA post, I think, is like, in my head, it was the worst interview ever. I was interviewed by, so I think this is for the Royal Holloway people. I was interviewed by Yaki Tavanen, who everyone knows is like a really, really lovely person. To me, he was the scariest person in the world. Him and Kathy interviewed me. And And one of the questions, they wanted to know, do you have strong statistical knowledge? I did a linguistics degree with no formal statistics training, and they asked, could you explain a bit more what p-value is? And the only thing I said in response to that question was, it's something to do with 0.5, isn't it? Not even 0.05. I just went, it's something to do with 0.5. And they said, can you elaborate? And I said, no. And they asked me to do an Excel task, and out of pure nerves, I messed it up. And I went, well, I don't know why it's not working, but this is what I would have done. And I was amazed when I got the call 2 days later to say, you've got the job. And the reason that Kathy, who was my PI, gave me the job is she said, yes, I can see that your statistical skills need some work, but the fact that you tailored it so much to the project and you'd learned so much about our research area showed how willing you were to learn. And I think you'd be a great person to work with for your development. So again, if you go into an interview and you mess up a question or something goes wrong, that doesn't make it a write-off. Like, just take the next question, like just try and like do the best you can, and it doesn't have to be a perfect interview for you to necessarily get the job.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is that, look, we're all human. We understand that people are nervous, that you're not always going to speak so eloquently. I mean, to be honest, my feedback in almost every interview I've had is I could do better. Like, I'm just not a great at interviewing, just not my kind of cup of tea, but you can nonetheless still get jobs even if you're not the best, if you can kind of show your passion, done your homework, and really prepared, that you can come out with things that maybe other people might not have thought of. So I think it's a really good point. Before you guys go, I just wanted, and I've been finishing these talks with a bit of a quiz where I start to put you to the test to see what kind of knowledge that you have. And Amrita, you've already taken part in one of these before, but this one is, I think it's the same one that you did, but we've got different questions this time, but it's called, did it replicate? Just because maybe these things didn't replicate in this case doesn't mean the first effect is not true. There are many, many reasons as to why an effect may not replicate. What I'll do is I'll describe the experiment to you, the original procedure, and then you'll have to guess whether you think in many labs too, the finding did or did not replicate. Maybe you can give some insight into whether the reasons why you think that was. So the first one I'm going to ask is what's called the trolley dilemma. Does anyone know what the trolley dilemma is? It's very famous.
Is it the moral dilemma?
Yes, yeah, specifically about a trolley, I think, but I'm not entirely.
Yeah, oh no, I wasn't correct you. I meant, yeah, is it the one where you've got like 2 trains? Anyway, I feel like you were about to tell us.
No, you're exactly right. It's the kind of things where you have 2 trains and you have to make a decision, and it's a moral dilemma about what you would do. Now, this is called the principle of double effect. This principle states that an act that harms other people is morally permissible if the act is a foreseen side effect rather than the means to a greater good. Now, just to kind of contextualize what that means in the experiment, in the foreseen side effect condition, a person on an out of control train changed the train's trajectory so that it killed 1 other person than 5. So that's a foreseen side effect. That you can see that in one case you kill 5 people, and in the other case, by switching, you kill 1 person. So that's the foreseen side effect. But in the greater good condition, the person pushes a fat man in front of a train to save 5 people. So in this case, it's more about a greater good. So it's about you've chosen someone to be pushed in. I don't know how necessarily that stops a train, but let's just ignore that that case. Maybe it's just a Thomas the Tank Engine train, but then that opens many ambiguities. Anyway, the point is, in the original experiment, 89% of people judged the foreseen side effect as permissible. So 89% said, if you're a person on an out of control train, if they change the trajectory so it only kills 1 instead of 5, that's permissible. However, in the other condition where you pushed somebody in front of a train, only 11% in that greater good scenario judged it as permissible. Now, do you think that replicated? I'd also know that most of these experiments rely on very small participants, and this is probably one of the reasons why, as we know, replications often fail because of small sample sizes. So who wants to replicate?
I'm guessing it would replicate just on it.
Me too. I think the premise doesn't seem fundamentally flawed. As in, when you were describing the scenario, you could kind of say, oh, that's probably what I would have said as well. And
yeah.
I think you're all going for it replicated. Okay. Yes, you are all correct. It did replicate. I think maybe that was a bit of a clue there was the large effect size might indicate that it's probably a fairly robust effect, even if they might have relied on small participants. It probably meant the original experiment was fairly well powered. Though that being said, the effect size was smaller in this replication, as we might expect with large samples. Now, just in case anyone is going, what the hell are they going on about effect sizes? An effect size is basically a way that which, as psychologists, we can essentially map out the kind of real world terms of an effect. So larger effect sizes we think about as being having more kind of impact in terms of how they might play out in real life. And as we go to smaller effect sizes, we kind of get to a point when we say, look, even if it's significant, it's so trivial. And I think normally there's a kind of cutoff where we're kind of saying, look, below this, it really doesn't make a difference. Although, again, if we're really going to get questionable about this, not everyone agrees on that point either. So let's just keep it very binary and simple. Let's go to the second one then. This one is called reluctance to tempt fate. So in this study, they explored the belief that tempting fate, or people's belief that tempting fate increases bad outcomes. So what the participants were told in this, again, I have no idea what the sample size was in the original experiment, but they were told to imagine a classmate called John, who tempted fate, and he tempted fate in this case by coming to class very stupidly unprepared for whatever the class assignment was. Let's imagine it's like a presentation, for example. Or John didn't tempt fate by coming to the class fully prepared as he was supposed to do so. And obviously we'd all recommend that you do come to class prepared. The participants in the experiment were asked to estimate how likely they thought John would then be called on by his lecturer. And in the original experiment, when people were given the scenario where they were asked to imagine for him having tempted fate, so he didn't come prepared, people increased their belief that he would then be more likely to be picked on, even though really there would be no basis for such a belief because the lecturer would have probably no clue whether you did or didn't. But people believed that by tempting fate, John was more likely to get picked on. Do you think that replicated?
I'm going to say no.
Say no.
Yeah.
That sounds dubious.
You're saying dubious. I want to know your reasonings why this sounds dubious.
It sounds like the participants have to kind of base it on feeling or emotion rather than any sort of logic. So you're probably going to get a lot of individual differences between people, which will make it harder to replicate.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other views apart from just maybe it's too complex to just kind of have a simple binary outcome?
I guess people's intuitions about probabilities are generally quite off. Like people don't tend to behave logically. And so in this one circumstance, I guess, yeah, what would be the chances of you? Also, people, as Claire said, are very different in terms of how logical they are. So I'm not sure. I don't think it would have been a very large effect to start with since we talked about effect sizes. And so I don't think it would have necessarily replicated.
Okay, so I'll put you out your misery. The effect did in fact replicate.
Really?
The effect size was smaller by about half. So again, it suggests that the effect is not as big as the original experiment indicated. I agree with you, Claire, that I generally think when I see these kind of studies where it's just this one manipulation, no real controlling for individual differences or thinking about potential moderators and the effect, I'm always like, that's not going to replicate. But I guess, I suppose, it is maybe not an uncommon belief that people would hold, that they might think about tempting fate is always a bit, we see it in kind of popular TV. I can imagine people start to endorse that as a genuine belief that they kind of hold. Though I agree with you, certainly, I think that you are more likely to tempt fate and get a null finding, see what I did there, if you don't think about potential moderators to your effect. Okay. So I think all of you are on one so far. So this is for the win. Let's go with this one. Now, I have to say, I have no idea what the rationale behind this study is. Unfortunately, space is limited in this in papers. So if you want to go and find out more about precisely why they would predict these things, then go for it. This one is called Affect and Risk. Now, I picked this one because I think it just sounded silly. But nonetheless, have a guess. Now, 40 participants, I can tell you the sample size of this one, 40 participants chose whether they would prefer what was called an effectively attractive option, and they were told that was a kiss from their favorite movie star. So let's just assume that's, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio, or, you know, if you want to throw in who your favorite movie star is, then please do go ahead. Or a financially attractive option, which was $50. And they were told, in one condition, they were told the probability of that outcome was very high, so it was basically certain. And in the other condition, they were told the probability of the outcome was very low. They were told it was a 1% chance that it would occur. Now, in the original experiment, when people were told that the outcome was certain, people preferred to take the $50. In the unlikely condition, when people were told it was just a 1% chance, people interestingly preferred to take the kiss from the movie star. Now, again, this is not my area of research. I haven't had loads of time to go and dig into precisely why this prediction would be the case, but I thought it was a kind of funny experiment to imagine whether people would prefer a kiss from their favorite movie star or $50. Now, do you think, did this replicate in many labs too?
It's such a crazy experiment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to assume there is actually some real good reasoning and logic. I mean, psychology is based on pretty good reasoning and logic, but sometimes experiments sound really strange when you kind of take them out of context. And this is a real taken out of context experiment.
In what case would you ever believe that a researcher has like the power to, you know, they probably have the power to give you $50. They probably don't have the power to give you a kiss from your favorite movie star.
I don't know. I mean, in social psychology, we come up with some very elaborate, deceptive things. Who, for all we know, they were told next door, Leonardo DiCaprio is waiting. So, you know, if you're lucky and you're right, then you'll get that kiss. Who knows? We have very good, powerful, deceptive powers. Do you think it replicated?
Oh, I mean, it sounds like people are terrified to meet their heroes, doesn't it? I'm just trying to work out whether that would replicate or not.
Yeah.
I guess maybe base it on your own instinct. Under the kind of 1% chance, would you rather the kiss or $50? And under the certain chance, would you prefer the kiss or $50? And then, I mean, that's probably the way that I would think about it, considering.
I don't think it would replicate, because I'm basing it on, I mean, I'd be quite keen on $50. It would be great. I've just had to pay my car road tax, and having $50 now would be great. But and also $50 is a lot of money to some people and not to others. So that point have been controlled very well. So I think that it won't have replicated.
I think it might have. I'm in a different position now. I think I've gone with, so if I was in that weird situation and it's a 1% chance, I'd go for the kiss. I may as well gamble it now.
All right, so Claire's going for it didn't, Amrita's going for it did replicate. Saloni, which side are you going to go with?
I'm gonna go didn't, but that's partially because, I don't know, it'd be coming out here, but like a kiss is not appealing to me at all. In any circumstance, the money is very appealing.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we get back into these individual differences again. I'm very skeptical about any study that does this and just can say that's an effect. I mean, maybe in some cases it's fairly robust. So the answer is it did not replicate.
Did it not?
In fact, it was significant in the opposite direction. Those researchers probably were tearing their hair out when this got published. Not only did this not go, oh, it wasn't an effect, it was an effect in the complete opposite direction, which, I mean, it's great. This is obviously part of what science is about, but for those guys, it must have been very perplexing at the time when they found out that a new sample had found the completely opposite effect. I think that might be fairly rare. Okay, thanks very much. Claire and Saloni, therefore, you are joint winners of this quiz. So congratulations. I have nothing to give you. You know, congrats. That's all you get.
Not even Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, he is.
Is he next door?
Very shortly. Sorry, Amrita just informed me about the prize. Yeah. Anyway, thanks very much for taking part, and really useful for your insights about gaining research experience. And I hope to see you guys again soon.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to see everyone.
No problem. See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!